Go back into South Bend's history. 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, and what do you see? You see groups of people working to bring change to this city. They had different ideas of what that change should be. They didn't always agree. Yet, in every decade, there were groups of people for whom positive change was their life's work. This podcast, South Bend's Own Words, features the voices of people who helped make the city change. We'll share clips from the oral histories done by the Indiana University South Bend Civil Rights Heritage Center that tell a more complete history of the city. It's the story of many cultures, not just one. It's the story of South Bend. This year, the Indiana University South Bend Civil Rights Heritage Center celebrates 21 years since its founding. So many people deserve tons of credit and recognition. Two of them are Dr. Les Lamon and David Healey. Dr. Lamon was a longtime history professor at IU South Bend. He started the first Freedom Summer class in 2000. That class put students on a bus and drove them through the South. They learned the history of the Southern Civil Rights Movement from some of the people who made that history, and they stood in the places where that history was made. David Healey was a student on that first tour. He became an early founding member of the Civil Rights Heritage Center on campus and led the early oral history program. He saved the life stories of dozens of local people, the very stories we've shared on this podcast. David passed away in March 2010. 2 months too soon to see the results of his research and organizing to transform the former Engman Public Natatorium. In May 2009, Les and David were on a road trip to Fort Wayne, and Les turned on the tape recorder. He and David talked about their inspirations as white men to study the African American civil rights movement, and about forming and leading the early days of the Civil Rights Heritage Center.
David, as we've talked about, you and I have shared conversations for years about our interest in the history of African Americans in South Bend and this general part of Indiana. Exactly how did you get interested in what has become a major part of your life?
Well, my family has asked me that question numerous times. I suppose it goes back to my early childhood when I was not involved in the civil rights movement, but I do recall watching the pictures on TV of Birmingham and Martin Luther King, and I guess I was a freshman or sophomore in high school. I was too young to participate in it, but I was fascinated with the pictures. I remember my father, who told me that he was convinced Martin Luther King was a communist. I don't know if I quite believe that or not. But I forgot about the civil rights movement, because one of the things about the civil rights movement is that, as far as from the white perspective, the civil rights movement happened, we corrected all the problems, and forget it. But that's not true. I had experiences in college when Martin Luther King was assassinated. I was on campus that morning, and the black students had barricaded themselves inside of the student union. Several of my professors were there at the time. I stood on the steps forming a barrier between the students who were trying to get into the student union and the black students who were locked inside. There was a lot of emotion, a great deal of emotion. A lot of words said, a lot of people just being silent. It was an impact on a young, I guess I was 18 maybe.
This was Western
Michigan University. And I thought that was pretty powerful as I was standing there watching all this unfold as a young man. Later, of course, I quit college. I wanted to see what the world was like, I guess, and the world at that time was give you a one-way ticket to Vietnam. So I ended up in Vietnam, and then, of course, came back and started a career and family, and I forgot about most of that until I re-entered college, taking history courses, and I took courses with Dr. Tetzlaff on African American history, and I was fascinated with the struggle, because I'd never really learned anything about slavery in this country, or what it meant, or what the sacrifices were, of what these people endured. And then one afternoon, this professor comes in. I think his name was Dr. Lamon, and he had this brochure in his hand, and he had this wild idea that he was going to take a tour of the civil rights movement in the South. And I'm thinking, and why in the world would we spend 2 weeks in the South looking at the past civil rights movement? Frankly, I thought it was a crazy idea. But the brochure and his speech and really made an impact on me, and for some reason, I had to go on that trip. It was illogical. I couldn't afford it. I didn't have time, blah, blah, blah. But I found the money. I found the time. I went on the trip. It was a life-changing experience. I met some of the most fantastic people I've ever met. I was there at Birmingham. I was there at the park. I was there at the church where Martin Luther King and Abernathy were facing the crowd, and Kennedy was trying to make his mind up whether he was going to send in some help for them. And you listen to these people, and they recount their experiences, and you can't help but be moved by it. And when I came back from that trip, I was changed on my belief or perspective of the civil rights movement. It was a history, it was a body of history that needed to be preserved, investigated, interpreted. It wasn't over. We had made tremendous strides, but we had a long ways to go. I knew that from my own experiences in life. And I wanted to be part of it. I wanted to help out. And that's primarily what motivated me, was collecting this information because I thought it would make a difference.
At some point, I remember, I know that I got a small grant from the Indiana Humanities Council to do an oral history focused on the civil rights movement. And the idea is that, like everything in the Civil Rights Heritage Center would be student-led, that you would be the director of that grant. And you would be initially, I think, maybe...
I remember that day very well. We were having a meeting at the restaurant south of South Bend. I can't remember the name of it. And I was sitting there with Candace and Amy, and you were talking about this project. And you said that I was going to be the student director of it, which shocked me to no end. So I never done any interviews before. Doing oral interviews is something I wasn't really up on, but we went on a couple, and I found that I had a real, I think I had a real ability to do oral interviews. I could put people at ease when I'm doing an interview, and I also had enough knowledge of the history that I could talk intelligently to these people about people from the past. And if you can bring up a name, you bring up something concrete that they remember in their past, you have a way into their interview that you can't get just sitting there asking questions. You have to have some way to identify with them so that they understand it. You actually might know what you're talking about.
And the more you do, the more you can get them to talk about it.
Exactly. The more I know, the more I can jog their memory and say, oh yes, I remember that. This is what happened. And those interviews became very, very fulfilling for me. Not all of them. Some of them, every oral interviewer runs into people who have a tape in their head and they play it for the interview, or you run into people who really don't know that much about the subject.
But they want to talk to you.
But they want to talk to you anyway. They want to talk about their great grandmother, and then you have to figure out a way to get them back on track. And it's oral interviews is an art form. They're a lot of fun, but they're also a lot of work. And trying to get the information you want and not have them go off on a tangent on something totally irrelevant. That's the key.
I believe the title of your thesis is Tugging on the Reins of Power. What did they want that political influence for?
Well, they wanted access to, they wanted what white people had. They wanted police protection. They wanted fire protection. They wanted their streets paved. They wanted running water in their homes. They wanted a decent school for their kids. They wanted access to the home ownership. They wanted to stop segregation, stop being forced into living in certain areas of South Bend.
Or sit upstairs in the movie theater.
Or sit upstairs in the movie theater. All affronts must be challenged in some form or another. And the only way to do that is through political activism and legally. And that's what they chose to do.
Okay. So what I hear you say is that we might have desegregated the natatorium in 1950. We might have hired the first 3 or 4 black teachers in the schools in 1950. But there was still a need for a significant civil rights movement in South Bend into the 50s and 60s to address these housing, jobs, that kind of thing. Education.
The residue, we had a golden opportunity to correct many of these problems in the 1940s, and we chose not to do it. We let this lingering problem sort of coexist. It's still not over to this day. You can still trace it in the hiring practices of some of our corporations around town. It's you can pass a law, you can say you're desegregated, but you can't desegregate your mind. And until we win that battle, we still have a long ways to go.
And that perhaps is part of the mission of the new and redirected natatorium.
South Bend's Own Words was created by Kevin Tidmarsh and me, George Garner. This episode was produced by Juitu Pangani from the Ernestine M. Racklin School of the Arts at IU South Bend, and by me through the Civil Rights Heritage Center. Visit us and learn how IU South Bend students inspired the transformation of a once segregated South Bend swimming pool. We give guided tours and offer public events that show how the history of oppression echoes through the city today. See and hear more history, plan your visit, or share your thoughts about this episode, all at crhc.iusb.edu.